Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows, where the quiet corners of family life meet the loud echoes of memory and truth. These are not just stories. They are lessons wrapped in love, regret, and the difficult choices that define us. If you find yourself touched, if you hear your own family's footsteps in these tales, we invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Because every week we gather here to remember that family is both shadow and light. Today's story is called "They Hid Mom's Hospital Bills, So I Brought the Receipts to Thanksgiving." Robert Lane was not a man of many words. At 65, silence had become his most faithful companion. It wasn't that he didn't know what to say. He had lived long enough, worked hard enough, loved deeply enough to know 1,000 things worth saying. But words, he discovered, could not mend a broken heart. And Robert's heart had been broken the day Katherine took her last breath. She had been his wife for 42 years. Katherine was the girl he first kissed in a high school gymnasium, the woman who sewed curtains for their first small home, the mother who held their children against her chest after long nights of fever and fear. When cancer came, it stole her slowly, like a thief who lingered in the house too long, touching every drawer, every corner, until there was nothing left untouched. Robert sat through every chemo session. He held her hand when the veins in her arms became too weak for more needles. He whispered prayers into her ear when she was too tired to keep her own eyes open. And when the doctors came in with the final bill, thick envelopes with numbers printed so large they seemed to shout, Robert nodded silently, slid the papers into his jacket and carried them home. He told no one, not Matthew, his son who lived just 30 minutes away in a 2-story house with a brand new SUV in the driveway, not Melissa, the daughter-in-law who loved to host and post about her family sacrifices, not even Rebecca, his gentle daughter who visited twice a week with soup and stories from her classroom. No, Robert bore it alone, because fathers do that. They carry the weight. They tell themselves it is their job to shield the children, even when those children are fully grown. They believe silence is strength, that enduring without complaint is love. But silence has a sound. It is the crinkle of another hospital bill arriving in the mailbox. It is the scrape of Robert's pen across his checkbook late at night when the world is asleep. It is the quiet sigh he makes when he opens his dwindling savings account online, the one he and Katherine had dreamed of using for a trip they never took. He signed each payment with a steady hand, though his own hands were trembling. He did the math until numbers blurred. He gave up his woodworking hobby, sold his tools, actually, to cover another round of fees. The garage, once filled with the smell of sawdust and the rhythm of hammer against nail, was now empty. Bare walls, bare shelves, but still he never spoke. The irony was bitter. Out in the wider family circle, Matthew and Melissa were being praised. "They've been angels," an aunt said at the funeral, clasping Melissa's hand. "Taking care of Katherine like that, such devotion, Robert must be so proud." Robert forced a smile. Proud. Yes, proud of Katherine, proud of Rebecca, proud of the memories that made him who he was. But proud of lies? No. He remembered standing near the casket, his suit too tight around his shoulders, when Melissa leaned toward Matthew and whispered, thinking no one could hear, "It's better this way. Your dad will handle the rest." Handle the rest. 3 words that sank deep into his chest like stones. Robert did not confront them. He didn't want a scene at his wife's funeral. He didn't want Katherine's memory tangled with arguments and accusations. He swallowed the words, tucked them into his heart like another unpaid bill. At night, the house was too quiet. Robert would sit at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, spreading the bills across the wood surface like a dealer laying out cards. The amounts were staggering. $4, $200 for scans, $6, $700 for inpatient care, $1, $800 for prescriptions that barely helped. He remembered Catherine's voice, faint but insistent. "Don't let them fight after I'm gone, Robert. Promise me." And so he didn't. He let Matthew live in the illusion. He let Melissa post online about being a devoted daughter-in-law, about the trials of caring for family. He even nodded along when relatives said how blessed he was to have children who shouldered the burden. But every signature on every check was his. Every dollar drained came from the life he had built with Katherine. Sometimes he wondered if he was wrong. Should he have demanded Matthew step up? Should he have told Rebecca? But then he looked at his daughter's tired face, the lines forming around her eyes though she was only in her early 30s. A teacher's salary, student loans. Rebecca couldn't afford these bills, and Matthew. Confrontation would only harden his son's pride. So Robert kept quiet. One night he opened an old photo album. Inside was a picture of Katherine holding baby Matthew, her eyes shining with joy. Another page showed Rebecca, laughing with missing front teeth, perched on Robert's shoulders. He whispered to the empty room, "I kept my promise, Kate, but I don't know how much longer I can." Because the bills didn't stop. Even after her death, paperwork kept arriving. Insurance claims, outstanding balances, interest charges. Silence became unbearable. By the time autumn rolled around, Robert had nearly finished paying off the last of the hospital debts. His bank account was lighter, his retirement plans nearly erased, but the bills were gone. All that remained was the silence between what people believed and what was true. Then came the invitation. Melissa, in her cheerful handwriting on a family group message, "Thanksgiving at our place this year. Can't wait to celebrate all we've been through as a family. Matthew and I want to honor Mom's memory properly." Robert read the words twice. Honor Mom's memory. He folded the phone shut and set it down slowly. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He was a patient man, a quiet man, but there are limits even to silence. And Robert Lane had reached his. The Lane family had always been good at appearances. Holidays were a showcase, ironed tablecloths, the smell of cinnamon, plates arranged like magazine covers. Melissa prided herself on it. She had the kind of smile that made relatives lean in closer, nodding approvingly, convinced of her warmth. It was early November when Robert attended the first gathering after Catherine's passing. A cousin's birthday. Small, intimate, nothing more than cake, candles, and polite conversation. Yet even in that setting, the illusion began. Melissa floated around the room like the hostess she always wanted to be, though it wasn't even her house. She served drinks, fussed over napkins, placed her hand delicately on Matthew's shoulder whenever she wanted to direct attention his way. And of course, she said, her voice sweet but carrying, "Those months with Mom were hard. But Matthew and I, we knew it was our duty. We were there day and night. We sacrificed so much." The room responded just as she hoped. "You two are saints," said Aunt Caroline, patting her arm. "Robert must be so grateful." Robert, standing near the window with a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands, forced his mouth into something that looked like a smile. He kept his eyes on the darkness outside, where the yard light made the trees into tall, silent sentinels. Matthew shifted in his chair, puffing slightly with pride. "It wasn't easy," he added. "But when family needs you, you step up. That's how Mom raised us, right, Dad?" The words landed like pebbles thrown against Robert's chest. That's how Mom raised us. Katherine had raised them to tell the truth, to carry one another's burdens fairly. She hadn't raised them to hide bills in drawers and let their father's hands tremble over checkbooks at midnight. But Robert only nodded, a single, restrained nod. "Yes," he said quietly, "that's how she raised us." Rebecca noticed. She always noticed. Sitting across the room, her eyes followed the tiny flinch in her father's jaw, the way his fingers tightened around the coffee cup just a little too long. She didn't say anything, not yet, but the unease grew inside her like a shadow lengthening at sunset. The gathering went on. Melissa brought out her phone, scrolling to pictures she had carefully saved. One of her holding Katherine's hand in the hospital, another of Matthew by the bedside. "Look at this," Melissa said, showing the screen to a small cluster of relatives. "Those nights were endless. We hardly slept, but we kept going because that's what love does." The relatives murmured their admiration. "Beautiful," one said, "so selfless." Robert turned away. The truth was harder than photographs. Pictures froze moments, but they didn't tell the whole story. They didn't show who left early, who didn't come back the next day, who avoided eye contact with billing clerks at the hospital counter. He heard Melissa's voice again, lilting and proud. "We hardly slept." Robert thought of the recliner he had slept in for weeks beside Katherine, the way his neck had stiffened, the way nurses had brought him blankets at midnight when he wouldn't leave her side. He thought of the coffee-stained receipts still stuffed in his wallet, and he thought of the silence he had chosen. Later that night, as relatives said goodbye, Melissa embraced him warmly. "You're holding up so well," she said. "Katherine would be proud of how united we've been as a family." Her perfume clung to his jacket after she walked away, a sugary sweetness that made him feel sick. United, that was the word she used. Rebecca came to stand beside him in the doorway. She looked up at him with that teacher's concern, the one she usually saved for her struggling students. "Dad," she said softly, "are you okay?" Robert gave her the same answer he had given 100 times since Katherine passed. "I'm fine." But Rebecca studied his face, the drawn lines, the tiredness behind his eyes. She didn't believe him, not fully. Yet she let it go for now. 2 weeks later, another gathering. This time at Matthew and Melissa's house, a dinner for just immediate family. The table was immaculate, candles flickering, plates set with precision. Melissa had prepared a roast, vegetables arranged like artwork. As they ate, Melissa spoke again, weaving the same story almost word for word. "We couldn't abandon Mom in her final days. We gave everything. That's what family means." Rebecca's fork paused midair. Her eyes flicked to her father, waiting for a reaction. Robert placed his knife down carefully. His appetite had waned after Katherine died, and tonight was no different. He sipped water, then said, "Your mother was strong. She faced more than anyone should." "That's true," Matthew agreed quickly. "She was strong, but we helped her carry it. You know that, Dad." Rebecca's heart thudded. She searched her father's face. There it was again, the flicker of pain, the quiet endurance. Robert said nothing more. After dinner, while Melissa cleared plates and Matthew poured drinks, Rebecca slipped into the kitchen. Her father was already there, rinsing his glass. "Dad," she whispered, "why do you let them say these things?" Robert glanced at her, surprised. "What things?" "You know what things about Mom, about how much they did. It's not true, is it?" Robert dried the glass slowly, his shoulders heavy. "It doesn't matter," he said at last. "Let them have their story." "But it matters to you," Rebecca pressed. "I can see it. It's eating at you." He looked at her then, really looked at her. the same way he used to when she was 10 years old and demanding honesty about why kids at school could be cruel. His eyes were tired, but also protective. "You don't need to carry this, Becca," he murmured. "It's mine." Rebecca wanted to argue, but Melissa's voice floated in from the dining room. "Coffee, anyone?" Her father touched her arm gently, signaling the conversation was over. And so the illusion remained, polished and shining for everyone else. But in Rebecca's heart, the doubt was no longer small. It was growing, relentless, waiting for the day when silence could no longer hold it. Rebecca had always been the kind of daughter who noticed the small things. She noticed the way her students' hands fidgeted when they didn't know an answer, the way a colleague's smile didn't reach her eyes after a hard day. She noticed her father's gait too, how it had slowed just slightly in the months after Katherine's passing, how he lingered at the threshold of rooms as though listening for a voice that was no longer there. One Sunday afternoon, she stopped by her father's house unannounced, carrying a casserole in a foil pan. It was a habit she'd picked up since her mother died, bringing food, staying for a cup of tea, filling the silence with conversation so he wouldn't feel so alone. Robert greeted her at the door with a weary smile. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair a little unkempt. He looked as though he had been busy with something, though she didn't see any projects in progress. "Brought you dinner," she said. "You don't have to keep feeding me, Becca." "Humor me," she replied, brushing past him into the kitchen. She set the casserole down, and that's when she noticed the papers on the counter. A stack of envelopes, thick and official, some already opened, some not. Her eyes fell on the word hospital printed in bold at the top of one page. She froze. "Dad," she said softly, "what's all this?" Robert's hand moved quickly, gathering the papers into a neat pile. "Just mail, nothing important." But Rebecca wasn't a child anymore. She reached out, pulling one envelope before he could tuck it away. Her eyes scanned the page. Outstanding balance, $3 $486.72. Another line item listed payments already made, the signature on the checks, Robert Lane. Her throat tightened. "You've been paying all of this," she whispered. Robert sighed, resting both hands on the counter. He didn't answer. Silence was his admission. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" He turned to her, his eyes steady but sad. "What good would it have done? You're working long hours, barely making enough as it is. And Matthew," he stopped himself. "Matthew told everyone he was handling this," Rebecca said, anger creeping into her voice. "He let people believe he and Melissa sacrificed everything. Is that true? Did they pay anything at all?" Robert's silence stretched again, heavier this time. Finally, he said, "Your brother has his own way of dealing with things. That's not an answer. It's the only one you'll get from me tonight." Rebecca pressed the envelope against her chest. "This isn't fair. Mom deserved better than this. You deserve better." Robert softened then, reaching to touch her cheek like he used to when she was a little girl crying after a scraped knee. "Life isn't fair, Becca. We do what we can to keep peace. That's what your mother wanted." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Peace built on lies isn't peace at all. That night she lay awake, the image of those hospital bills burned into her mind. She remembered the way Melissa had paraded photos at the last gathering, how Matthew had accepted praise with a proud smile. It all made sense now. The way her father grew quieter whenever they spoke, the way his eyes seemed to dim during conversations about sacrifice. Rebecca began to wonder, if her father wouldn't tell the truth, would it fall to her? A week later, she stopped by again. Robert was in the living room, sorting through a shoebox of old photographs. Katherine's handwriting was still on the backs. Christmas 1997, first day of school, trip to the lake. Dad, Rebecca said gently, sitting beside him. I saw enough the other day to know what's happening. Please just be honest with me. Are Matthew and Melissa paying anything, or have you been carrying this alone? Robert kept his eyes on the photograph in his hand. Katherine, smiling in the kitchen, flour dusting her cheeks. I don't want you to hate your brother, he murmured. Rebecca swallowed hard. I don't hate him, but I hate the lie. Robert placed the photo back in the box and closed the lid. Some truths, if spoken at the wrong time, tear families apart. I don't know if I have the strength to see that happen. Rebecca reached for his hand. Then let me carry some of it with you, please. But Robert only shook his head. Not yet. Still, the doubt wouldn't leave her. She began to watch her brother more closely, listening to his words, measuring the distance between what he claimed and what she now knew. She noticed how Matthew avoided specifics whenever the topic of medical bills came up, how Melissa redirected conversations to their sleepless nights instead of actual numbers. Thanksgiving was approaching. Rebecca could feel it. Something was building. Her father's silence was cracking at the edges, and her own resolve was hardening. The illusion her brother and sister-in-law had spun was too fragile to last, and she knew deep in her heart that when the truth came out, it would not whisper, it would thunder. Thanksgiving came with the smell of roasted turkey and the sound of forced laughter. Melissa had been planning it for weeks, her text messages filled with exclamation marks. We'll honor Mom this year in a special way. Don't be late. It means so much to us to host. Rebecca drove to her brother's house with unease coiled in her stomach. She carried a pie, still warm, balanced on the seat beside her. The closer she came, the more she dreaded the performance she knew awaited her. Matthew's house stood tall in the suburbs, 2 stories of brick and glass. New siding, a freshly paved driveway, the SUV gleaming out front. Melissa opened the door before Rebecca had even knocked, her smile bright, her perfume sweet and cloying. "Rebecca," she said, her voice like a song rehearsed too many times. "You're here. Oh, that pie smells divine." Inside, the house sparkled. Candles flickered on every shelf, autumn wreaths hung on the walls, and the dining table stretched long, covered in linen and gold-rimmed plates. Relatives were already gathering, voices overlapping in cheerful noise. Robert sat near the end of the table, shoulders slightly hunched, his suit jacket a little too big now that grief had carved weight from his frame. He gave Rebecca a faint smile when he saw her, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. She placed the pie down and touched his shoulder lightly. "You okay, Dad?" she whispered. He nodded once. "I'm here, aren't I?" Rebecca squeezed his hand. Dinner began with the clatter of serving spoons and the chorus of "pass the potatoes." Melissa orchestrated everything, her hands fluttering, her laughter rising above the rest. Matthew carved the turkey with exaggerated precision, pausing to let his cousins compliment him on his skill. Halfway through the meal, when plates were full and wine glasses refilled, Melissa rose from her chair. She held her glass high, waiting until the chatter faded. "This year," she began, her voice swelling with practiced emotion, "we sit here with heavy hearts because Katherine isn't with us. But we also sit with gratitude for family, for sacrifice, for love." All eyes turned toward her. She gestured to Matthew, who stood slowly, placing an arm around her waist. "We gave everything we had for Mom in her last days," Melissa continued, her eyes shining just so. "It wasn't easy. We hardly slept. We worked through exhaustion, but we did it because family means everything." The room murmured approval. Someone clapped softly. Another relative dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Matthew raised his glass, adding, "And Dad, you've been through so much. But at least you didn't have to carry that burden alone. We carried it with you, just like Mom would have wanted." Rebecca's fork froze in her hand, her pulse quickened. At the far end of the table, Robert shifted in his chair. His hands, rough from years of work, rested flat on the tablecloth. His face gave nothing away, but Rebecca saw the storm beneath the calm. The relatives erupted in praise. "You two are remarkable. Selfless, truly selfless. Katherine would be proud." Melissa leaned into Matthew, her smile wide, her head tilted in the perfect angle of staged humility. Rebecca could hardly swallow. She looked to her father, willing him to speak, to shatter the illusion that hung over the table like a gauzy curtain. But Robert remained still, his silence as steady as the ticking clock in the hallway. She wanted to scream. Instead, she pressed her napkin into her lap and waited, because something in her father's eyes told her this was not over, not tonight. After dessert was served, pumpkin pie, pecan tart, whipped cream in silver bowls, the mood lightened. Children darted under the table, chasing each other, while uncles and cousins argued about football. But when Melissa brought out the framed photo of Katherine, taken 2 years earlier in the garden, her hair tied back, her smile soft, the room hushed again. Melissa placed it in the center of the table next to the half-empty wine bottle. "We want to honor her," Melissa said. "We want to remember her sacrifices and the way we as a family came together in her time of need." Rebecca's throat burned. She could not sit still any longer, but before she could rise, Robert moved first. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against tile silenced the room. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the head of the table where the photo of Katherine sat. In his hand was a thick envelope. He laid it gently beside the picture frame. The room grew still. No one yet knew what was inside. But Rebecca's heart pounded because she did. Matthew was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, raised his glass, and forced a laugh as though his father's movement were nothing unusual. "Well," he said, his voice a shade too loud, "before we dive into whatever Dad has brought, I think it's only right we give a toast. To Mom, to her memory, and to the sacrifices we made as a family to see her through." The guests murmured in agreement, lifting their glasses. Melissa leaned against his arm, her smile trembling on the edge of tears. It was the picture of devotion staged for an audience. Matthew's eyes flicked toward Robert as he lifted his glass higher. To carrying burdens together, to love that doesn't quit. There it was again, the lie polished into something noble. Words dipped in honey but hiding the taste of ash. Robert didn't move. He kept his hands on the back of his chair, steady, waiting. His eyes lingered on the photograph of Katherine, framed so carefully at the center of the table. For a moment, he wasn't in that room at all. He was in the hospital again, her hand weak in his, her whisper trembling. "Don't let them fight after I'm gone, Robert. Promise me." He had promised, and for months he had kept it, but promises could become prisons. Rebecca sat rigid in her seat, watching her father, watching her brother, feeling the tension twist inside her chest. She wanted to scream the truth across the table to strip away the facade. But she also knew this moment wasn't hers, it belonged to Robert. The glasses clinked. A chorus of "To Katherine" filled the air. Robert lifted no glass. He simply looked at his son, and his silence was heavier than any speech could have been. Matthew faltered. For a split second, his smile wavered. He lowered his glass and coughed lightly, trying to cover the crack in his performance. Melissa rubbed his shoulder, whispering something meant only for him, though the whole table could see. An uncle leaned forward. Robert, don't you want to say a few words, a toast of your own? All eyes turned to him. Robert drew in a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes before lifting something unbearably heavy. His gaze swept the table, faces he had known all his life, faces that carried his history and his wife's memory. But his words did not come. Not yet. Instead, he placed a hand on the envelope beside Catherine's photograph and rested it there like a weight waiting to be lifted. Rebecca's pulse hammered in her ears. She could almost hear her mother's voice whispering through the silence, urging her father forward. The illusion of sacrifice was teetering, fragile as glass. One push, one truth spoken aloud, and it would shatter. And Robert Lane, patient, quiet, burdened Robert, was standing at the edge, ready to decide whether to break it. Robert's hand lingered on the envelope as if it carried not just paper but years of silence. The room was alive with expectation, forks stilled, glasses halfway lifted. Even the children had quieted, sensing the shift in the air. Finally, Robert spoke. "For months," he began, his voice steady, low but clear, "I've listened. I've listened to stories told about sacrifice, about who carried what burden." His eyes did not leave Matthew's face. "I've listened and I've kept my promise to your mother to avoid fighting. But tonight, in her memory, I cannot allow lies to replace truth." He pulled the envelope open. The sound of paper sliding against paper echoed louder than it should have. He withdrew the stack, hospital bills, stamped and official, some creased with use, others still crisp. He laid them down on the table one by one like cards in a game no one wanted to play. $4, $200, he read softly, setting the first sheet down. Paid by Robert Lane. Another paper. $6, $700, paid by Robert Lane. A third. $1, $800, paid by Robert Lane. The room was silent but for his voice, reciting numbers like a litany of sacrifice. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the release of a burden too long carried. Robert placed the last statement down and straightened, his eyes sweeping across the table. Every bill, every cent, not by Matthew, not by Melissa, by me. A collective gasp rippled through the family. Some leaned forward, others drew back as though the truth itself might burn. Melissa's face flushed crimson. "That's not fair," she stammered. We were there emotionally. We gave our time. You can't measure everything in money." Robert turned to her, calm as a stone. "Money kept the lights on in that hospital room. Money paid for the medicine in Catherine's veins. Money bought her those final months. Do not speak to me of sacrifice when you hid the bills in a drawer and walked away." Matthew shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around the table for support that would not come. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words failed him. Rebecca's eyes brimmed with tears. She reached across the table, placing her hand over her father's. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. Robert nodded once, then looked at the photograph of Katherine, her smile forever frozen in the garden light. "I did it for her, not for applause, not for recognition, for her, and I would do it again." But then his tone hardened. "I will not, however, let my wife's memory be used to polish false reputations. Not in this house, not at this table." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Relatives looked between Matthew and Melissa, their earlier admiration dissolving into quiet judgment. The illusion had shattered, its pieces scattered across the linen like shards of glass. For the first time all evening, Robert felt lighter. The burden of silence was gone, replaced by truth laid bare in black ink and dollar signs. But what came next? The legacy he would declare, was something no one expected. The table was still vibrating with silence. Melissa's cheeks burned red, Matthew's jaw was tight, and the relatives who had once showered them with praise now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure where to rest their eyes. Robert stood straighter, the lines in his face etched deep with both pain and resolve. His hand rested not just on the stack of bills, but on a smaller envelope he had kept tucked beneath them. For a long moment he stared at Katherine's photograph, her familiar smile staring back, reminding him of nights they had dreamed about the future, about what they would leave behind when their time came. He cleared his throat, his voice lower now, softer, but carrying the weight of finality. "There's one more thing you should all know," he said. From the envelope he pulled out a folder embossed with a lawyer's seal. He opened it carefully, his fingers steady this time, and laid the document beside the bills. "This," Robert said, "is the Katherine Lane Scholarship Fund, established last month." Gasps broke across the table, heads tilted, eyes widened. Robert continued, his voice unwavering. "Your mother had a life insurance policy, a modest one, nothing grand. I could have used that money to patch the hole in my savings. I could have given it to my children who claimed so loudly to have sacrificed for her. But I didn't. Because legacy isn't about comfort, and it isn't about false pride." He looked directly at Matthew and Melissa, his eyes calm but unflinching. "I took every dollar of that policy and created something your mother would have been proud of. A scholarship for children who have the desire to learn but not the means. For young people whose futures hang by a thread, the way Katherine once feared ours might when we were young and poor." He paused, letting the words breathe in the room. "Her name will live on in classrooms, in diplomas, in young hearts who will walk further because she believed in education, in honesty, in lifting others up. That is her true legacy, not this performance, not applause at a dinner table." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, though they were not the kind born of humility. They were tears of humiliation. She gripped Matthew's arm tightly, whispering something no one else could hear. Matthew, his pride stripped bare, tried to speak. "Dad, you should have consulted us." Robert cut him off, his voice firm but not loud. "Consulted you, when you could not even face a hospital bill? No, Matthew, some decisions belong to those who carried the weight. Your mother carried me through 42 years, I carried her at the end. And now I will carry her legacy not for you but for the world she loved." Rebecca's hand trembled as she covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her eyes shone with something fierce, something proud. She whispered almost to herself, "Mom would have loved this." "Yes," Robert said softly, looking at her. "She would." The rest of the family remained hushed. Even the children seemed to understand that something sacred had unfolded. The scholarship papers, the receipts, the truth, they all lay together in the center of the table, like a quiet altar to Katherine's memory. Robert placed his hand gently on the folder, his voice lowering again. "If any of you wish to honor her, then do it honestly. Not with lies, not with borrowed glory, but with acts that give light instead of taking it. That is what Katherine deserves." No one moved, no one dared to. For the first time since his wife's death, Robert felt as though he could breathe again. The silence in the room was no longer his burden, it was his gift, a silence filled with truth. And though Matthew and Melissa sat pale and speechless, though relatives avoided their eyes, Robert knew this was not about shame. It was about clarity. And clarity, like light, was the beginning of healing. The candles had burned low, their wax pooling at the bases, as if time itself had slowed inside that dining room. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the quiet ticking of the clock in the hallway, and the whisper of truth that had finally found its voice at the Lane family's table. Robert remained standing. He looked around, not with anger, not even with disappointment anymore, but with a clarity that softened his features. "This," he said quietly, gesturing to the stack of bills and the scholarship papers, "is not about pride, it's about honesty. Katherine always believed that a family survives on truth. Without it, we are nothing more than strangers wearing familiar faces." His eyes drifted to the photograph of Katherine, her smile forever captured in the sunlight of another season. He touched the frame gently, his thumb brushing the glass as though he could feel her warmth through it. "Kate," he whispered, "I kept my promise, and I hope you see now, I didn't let lies steal your name, I gave it back to the light." Rebecca rose slowly, moving to stand beside him. She placed her arm through his and leaned her head against his shoulder. Her voice, trembling but strong, carried through the room. "Mom always said truth was the only thing that lasts. Tonight you've proven her right, Dad." Robert kissed the top of her head. For the first time in months, his chest felt light. The crushing weight of silence lifted. He could breathe again, not because the grief was gone, but because grief had been given its rightful place, untainted by falsehood. Across the table, relatives lowered their eyes. Some nodded, shame mixing with respect. Others simply sat still, reflecting on their own families, their own secrets, their own debts of gratitude left unpaid. Matthew stared at the tablecloth, unable to meet his father's gaze. Melissa's tears streaked down her cheeks, but she said nothing. For them, the applause had ended, and all that remained was the hollow echo of their deception. Robert didn't need them to apologize. He didn't need to win. The truth had spoken louder than any defense they could muster, and in its echo, Katherine's name had been restored. The night ended quietly. Relatives slipped on their coats, murmured goodbyes, and stepped out into the cold November air. The house emptied, but the weight of what had been revealed lingered like a bell that had been rung, and could not be unrung. When the last door closed, Robert remained at the head of the table, staring at the papers one final time. Then, with care, he gathered them together, folded them into the folder, and tucked them under his arm. He would take them home, not as burdens anymore, but as proof of love and truth. Rebecca squeezed his hand before they left. "You did the right thing, Dad. You honored her." Robert smiled faintly. "No, Becca, she honored us. I just reminded everyone of it." As they stepped out into the cold night, the stars above seemed brighter than before, as though Katherine herself was shining through them, lighting their way home. And that, dear friends, was today's story. They hid Mom's hospital bills, so I brought the receipts to Thanksgiving. In every family, shadows fall, lies, pride, silence. But it is truth, steady and unwavering, that becomes the light guiding us back to one another. Robert's story reminds us that love is not measured in applause or appearances. It is measured in the sacrifices made quietly, in the honesty that endures, and in the legacies we leave behind. Thank you for listening to Family Shadows. We hope this story touched your heart and reminded you of the strength found in truth and love. If it did, please subscribe and stay with us as we share more stories of family, sacrifice, and redemption. Until next time, we wish you health, peace, and the joy of family. May your homes be filled with light, and may your hearts remain strong in both shadow and sunshine.